Welcome to the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, a podcast for business owners sharing the latest news and tips about customs clearance and freight forwarding. Welcome to episode 11 of the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, Customs Broker. In this episode, we will be discussing the topic of prefabricated buildings, granny flats, and shipping container homes. So, Peter, let's start with an overview. What are prefabricated buildings, granny flats, and shipping container homes, and why are they a popular choice for housing?
So at the moment, we are seeing a lot of these goods coming into the country, and basically a prefabricated home is something that's already been built and it's ready to go once it's been delivered to the address. So in the situations we see, we'll see that the prefabricated building, it has the rooms, the walls, the partitions, the shower, the bathroom, the lounge room, air conditioner. There may or may not be other equipment within the prefabricated building or the granny flat, but basically it's a building that's been made to the importer's specification, and then once it is delivered to their address, it gets placed onto the ground. They'll employ their own electrician and plumber and have it all set up, and then it's ready to go, ready to be lived in.
Now, before purchasing a prefabricated building or shipping container home from overseas, what important factors should importers consider to ensure a smooth import process?
There's so many different issues, and I think we'll touch on a few of them now. Like the first issue is, where is the container home going to be delivered to? So I guess what I'm doing here is I'm actually working backwards a little bit. I'm asking the questions that need to be asked at the end instead of worrying about the questions at the beginning. So the importer should be thinking, where are we going to put this container home? How are we going to get this container home out of the container if it's in a shipping container? Do we need a crane company to meet the truck for when the goods are delivered? Then working backwards, we then have to ask the questions: who's going to collect the container from the wharf when it arrives into Australia? Then moving backwards again, moving back to where the container home is being made, is we have to ask questions about, does the supplier who's making this container home, this prefabricated building, have they had their components tested for asbestos to meet the Australian Border Force requirements? So this is a big issue, and it's a costly issue, and overseas suppliers will say, we ship to Australia all the time. That's just a proverb that they say to make you feel comfortable. They will say that they have papers to show that there's no asbestos in the cement fiberboard or the insulation panels, but the Australian Border Force will reject those supporting documents unless these test certificates, these test reports are to a standard that they require, and usually it is to a standard which we refer to as NATA, N-A-T-A, and the best way to resolve this cement fiberboard and insulation material scenario problem is, for the supplier, is to FedEx or DHL samples of those products to a NATA laboratory in Australia. Then a test report, test certificate is provided, and then when the file is submitted to the Australian Border Force, and if any queries arise, then we can then show the ABF that this container home, this prefabricated building, has had the two highest risk factor items in the container home tested, which are usually and tend to be the cement fiberboard and the insulation panels. Then that will then appease the ABF, but then we then have to work through the agriculture, the biosecurity, the quarantine issues, and this department will be concerned with was any plywood used in the container home or the granny flat or the prefabricated building? Are there any timber components? Is the plumbing new or pre-owned, or has the plumbing been pre-used? So I understand that it sounds a bit strange that why would someone use pre-used plumbing in a container home or a prefabricated building, but this is just a risk factor that the agriculture biosecurity quarantine department has, and we have to make sure that they're happy with what your supplier has stated on the declaration. So that's and then just I was about to leave that area, but I need to also say that if the container home or the prefabricated building is going to be delivered to a non-metropolitan postcode as defined in their policy, then the container will need to be inspected before it can leave the metropolitan area to go to a rural postcode. But that's part of the delivery process, so that's not a major issue, but the more important issues are surrounding the plywood, the timber, and the plumbing components. Then we then add an extra layer, and this extra layer is in relation to ozone depleting gases. So as I mentioned, some of these container homes, granny flats, prefabricated buildings will come pre-installed with air conditioners, fridges, possibly a freezer. The ozone depleting gases that are used in these granny flats, there's particular gases that are prohibited, and so we need to make sure that the devices that are installed don't have the prohibited refrigerant gas.
Once the goods arrive in Australia, what are the options for collecting the full container load or FCL from the wharf? And what are the steps for taking the FCL to an unpack depot or directly to the client's premises for unpacking?
So once the vessel comes into the port or the wharf, then it needs to be in usual circumstances, these items are usually within another shipping container. So when I say a container home or a granny flat or a prefabricated building, it usually is sitting within another shipping container. So what happens is that external shipping container gets lifted from the vessel to the wharf. The wharf wants that container off their land pronto, so otherwise they will charge storage. So then we would collect the container from the wharf, and then a few things could happen. One option is that the whole shipping container with the granny flat inside will go to the importer's premise, and then the importer will then unpack the shipping container with either a crane company meeting the trucking company to unpack that container. That could be option one. And when I say that about option one, is usually that scenario works if the customer lives on a rural property and there is space and there's land and there's room for a semi-trailer to come onto the land with the shipping container. Then there's a crane company ready to take the goods out of the container. That could be scenario 1. Scenario 2 is maybe a customer who lives in a metropolitan area and doesn't have room for a shipping container to block the road or to obstruct traffic. So then we would take the container from the wharf to an unpack depot, unpack the shipping container, and then we may, for example, we may put the container home onto a tilt tray or a tow truck vehicle, and then when the container home is delivered to the metropolitan area, it can then be slid off the tilt tray at the importer's premise. That could be scenario 2. Or scenario 3 could be where the actual container home, the prefabricated building, is not within a shipping container, and the goods can just go from the wharf to the importer's premise. And then when the goods get to the importer's premise, then there would have to be a crane company there to take the container home off the truck. So scenario 3 is not the usual scenario, but scenario 1 and 2 are the most common. And then I just wanted to say that some people have said to us, and because we're customs brokers throughout Australia and we clear these container homes and prefabricated buildings everywhere in Australia, some people say to us that their local council says that it's difficult to get approval to put a container home on their property. So then one customer found a way where they import the container home on a trailer, and then they place the trailer and the container home on their property, and they don't need council approval because the container home is, I guess, not considered a permanent fixture on the property. So that's just a I don't know, food for thought for those customers who might find it difficult to get approval to put a container home on their property.
Now, you've mentioned some specific issues with regards to the ABF and things like asbestos test reports and certificates, as well as from the DAF regarding importing prefabricated buildings, including wooden components and the plumbing components. But how does the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water, or the DCEEW, regulate items like air conditioners, fridges, and freezers in imported prefabricated buildings?
This government department, which is like the third government department involved with these goods, their focus is about ozone depleting gases and about the refrigerant gas that has been used to charge the fridge, the freezer, or the air conditioner. So there's nothing worse than being able to satisfy the ABF with the asbestos test reports, being able to satisfy the DAF in quarantine with the plywood and the timber and the plumbing issue, but then have issues about the ozone depleting gas. And usually this topic, this issue, is usually the one that isn't at the forefront of importers' minds. And a lot of importers just assume that if I can purchase a fridge, freezer, or air conditioner from overseas, then it must be okay. But you can't rest on that assurance, and so we always ask the overseas supplier who is building the prefabricated building to provide us with further details about the air conditioner, the fridge, the freezer, so that we can make certain that either one, these items do not have any gas in them at the time of shipping, or two, make certain that the refrigerant gas that has been used is going to satisfy and appease the environmental department.
Now, in the Adelaide case study, where the overseas supplier could not provide asbestos test certificates, what steps were taken to ensure compliance and how was the asbestos testing conducted in Adelaide?
So this case study, which was about a Adelaide importer, they imported a prefabricated building, and the overseas supplier had provided paperwork, but the paperwork for the cement fiberboard and the insulation panels was not to the NATA standard that the ABF requires. So the overseas supplier attempted to provide documentation to say that they don't use asbestos materials and that this granny flat doesn't have any asbestos. But that's just an overseas supplier preparing a document and signing it, and to the ABF, it's a worthless piece of paper because the ABF on their website has a lot of material saying that when you wish to import items which could be an asbestos risk item, then this is the procedures that need to be followed. So regrettably, the South Australian importer, the container arrived at Flinders Port. Then the container needed to go to the unpack depot, and then the container stayed at the unpack depot. We arranged a asbestos hygienist, a asbestos testing technician to meet the ABF at the depot so that the granny flat could be unpacked from the container. Samples were to be taken, samples were taken, and then the granny flat was then packed back into the shipping container. Then it then takes, let's say, up to a week to receive those results. Then it was found that there was no asbestos issue. So then the goods could then be unpacked from the shipping container again. Then the importer could then come to the depot to collect the granny flat. And the process, one, was financially detrimental because every time the goods were being unpacked or repacked into the container, there's a charge. While the container's sitting at the depot, there's a charge per calendar day for the depot to store the goods. Then every time that a forklift touches the goods, there's going to be risk of damage. So if you imagine the prefabricated building was made overseas, it had to be packed into a shipping container. So it was touched once. Then the container went to the unpack depot in Adelaide. It had to be unpacked for the asbestos technician to take samples. It was touched twice. Then it had to be repacked into the container in case it had asbestos. That's been touched 3 times. Then the goods were released, so the goods could be unpacked. It was touched 4 times. Then the goods had to be forklifted onto the importer's transport vehicle. Then it was touched the 5th time. So the goods, the more that goods are touched, the chances of damage, and there was some damage to this importer's granny flat, and the importer then had to contact their insurance company to see what compensation they could receive. It's always difficult to say where the damage occurred, but there was some damage, and as you can see, this granny flat, this container home, was touched at least 5 times. So the more that it is touched, the more risk, the higher the chance of damage.
Now, in the Dampier case study, which encountered no issues at all, what factors contributed to the smooth importation process and what lessons can be learned from this example?
So with the scenario, the case study that we had an importer in Dampier, the importer purchased a container home, and the importer was based in a metropolitan area. It wasn't a rural postcode, so there was no quarantine inspection required based on the postcode. But we did still have to appease the agriculture department, DAF. So we addressed the plywood, the timber, the plumbing components. They were all addressed, and there were no issues with the Australian Border Force, and there were no air conditioners, freezers, or fridges. So this one was an easier project. There was no extra financial cost to the importer.
Now, how can Platinum Freight assist in processing prefabricated buildings, granny flats, and shipping container homes at any location in Australia?
We see this as a hot topic, and at the moment, so many importers are looking to purchase a container home, a granny flat, or a prefabricated building. Uh, it it's obvious that there is a housing issue, and these purchases do make sense where you can have a one or a two bedroom prefabricated building delivered to your location, and then it provides accommodation for either you you or your family, or you can use it as a to generate revenue from renting it out. So they are a hot topic, they are very popular, but there is so as you probably gauge from this podcast, there's so many issues, and a supplier overseas saying to you that we ship to Australia all the time to make you feel comfortable is just a comment, and providing an asbestos declaration on their letterhead and signature isn't going to appease the Australian Border Force. So I guess what I would say is find the supplier overseas that you wish to buy the prefabricated building from. That's usually the hardest part. But once you have the supplier, then reach out to someone like us who would then address all the issues with the overseas supplier and the importer together. And then we will soon learn what sort of declarations and certificates and test reports they do or don't have, and then assess the gap, and then advise the supplier what is needed to make this purchase go through.
Thanks for sharing your insights and tips, Peter. Now, to learn more about customs clearance and freight management services, visit platinumfreight.com.au.